Thank you for being with us for this first installment of Ask the Expert, a part of the U20 outreach activity program that the Mexican presidency of the G20 has established. The idea is to bring your questions directly to the G20 experts and make sure that there's a role for young people within the G20 process. Today, we have the honor of having with us a central figure in this year's G20 process, Ambassador Lourdes Aranda, Mexican Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, and Sherpa to the G20 process. Ambassador Aranda, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Robert. I'm really delighted to be here with you today.
Ambassador, as you know, the Mexican presidency has established an online fora for young people to be able to share their ideas about the issues that the G20 is looking at. The fora is located at the website of the G20 process, www.g20.org, with a link to the Y20 fora. Within this fora, we established one section that's called Ask the Expert, in which members of the international community, young people around the world, have posted questions that would like to ask you as Sherpa, as Mexican Sherpa on this process. But before we go to those questions, I would like you, if you can tell us a little more of what is a Sherpa? What does a Sherpa do within the G20 process?
Thank you. Yes, that's a name that really creates some questions about what it is. First, let me tell you what Sherpa means. It's an ethnic group in Nepal, in fact, and they are the ones who normally are in charge of taking the expeditions to the summits when people are climbing the biggest mountains. So they are in charge of conducting everybody to the summit, and that's something that we take from that name. That's what the Sherpas we do. We are the representatives of the leaders, and we are supposed to take the leaders to the summit. So we work all the way through the year, and in the summit, we are the ones who are in charge of coordinating the declaration and coordinating all the participants in the meeting.
Well, thank you. I think it's important to understand the role that the Sherpas play also in the negotiation process of the statements of the Leader Summit.
It's a long process, and yes, what we do is meet on a regular basis. At the beginning of a process, we set the agenda, and after we set the agenda, we start, developing among other experts, because Sherpas are not necessarily the experts, and they meet also in subgroups, and then we bring everything together. Of course, I have to point out that the Sherpas is one of the channels or the tracks of the G20 negotiation process, because the vice ministers of finance and central bank governors are also part of the process. So we're in charge of those issues which are more politically oriented, or which are not strictly economic, which they are hard to find because basically the G20 is an economic and financial forum. But yes, there are other issues that we're in charge of. Well,
let's get started with the questions that were posted for you. And the first one comes from Mexico, and it's regarding global governance. The question is global governance a mere political concept, or does it really have something that affects economic forces? Does it really help make changes to the way the economy functions?
Global governance relates to everything. I don't think it relates only to political issues. It relates to economic issues, to health issues, to climate change issues. Because global governance is a concept of how all countries we can organize ourselves and get to agreements through coordination and through negotiation. So you cannot say it's only for political issues. Of course, at the end, any negotiation has a political background, but global governance is how we decide, all of us, all the countries, that we're going to rule ourselves internationally, and what norms are we going to create, which ones are we going to agree with, and of course that's a long process of dialogue, of negotiation, of understanding each other's position. But that's what it means. Global governance is to have the institutions that help countries to live in peace and security among themselves.
And one of the questions that's been related to this and was posted as well is, what is the role of civil society within this review of the global governance agenda?
Well, I think civil society is increasingly playing a bigger role, and there are many stakeholders in civil society. What you say civil society is not only one sector of society. There are everybody, and they all have different opinions and different degrees of intervention. Of course, in this sense, civil society are young people in which some of them organize or some of them individually present or bring options to the table. Of course, these organizations which are bigger and have larger budgets and have a bigger impact, sometimes their voices are heard much more. And among them you can count organizations like business sector, like trade unions, defenders of human rights, of the environment. So civil society, it's a very large concept, but I do think that every time it's much more their impact in the definition of the international agenda and also on the definition of the agreements.
Following up on the idea of global governance, one of the fora that has been more active is the one regarding the future of the G20. And one of the questions and the ideas that have been posted the most have to do between the link between the G20 process and organizations such as the United Nations.
Yes, we have to go to the moment when the G20 was created to understand what can be the difference between what the G20 does and what the multilateral fora, which I mean, for excellence, it's the UN. So the G20 was created at the ministers' level in the 90s, mid-90s, after there were a series of financial crises in some of the developing countries, and the effect was felt all over the world, not only in those countries where the financial crisis took place. And that's when the ministers of finance realized that we have to talk among all of us and see how a domestic or an internal regulation or decision can affect the rest of the world. And then afterwards, when the crisis in 2008, it was decided that those countries should meet not only at the ministers' level, but try to meet at the leaders' level. And it was very important because there was an urgency to take measures that sometimes in those fora of universal participation, it takes longer to reach some agreements. So the G20 met at the leaders' level for the same time in November 2008, at the peak of the crisis, and they agree to take several decisions, which first it was in Washington, there was in London and in Pittsburgh, and I think those three first meetings were the ones who created the basis to have a G20 as a mechanism. I wouldn't like to call it a forum as it is, because it's a mechanism of coordination and in which it makes recommendations that it doesn't go to universal fora, like it may be the UN or it can be the IMF or the World Bank. So really the decisions are taken in this larger fora, but the coordination of policies are discussed and agreed among these 20 countries, which sometimes there can be more because there's a special guest, and then we also, there's always a representation of the international organizations in the G20 meetings. Now
this mechanism has in score the idea of the flexibility that it needs to make decisions. And one of the questions that has been asked is what's the trade-off between the flexibility that the G20 mechanism needs and the idea of creating a more institutionalized form of the G20? Are there any discussions about establishing the G20 with a secretariat as an international organization? I think the basic issue is enforcement of the decisions we take, which in other organizations are different measures of how to do it. In this case, it's a voluntary participation, and you are there because you are aware that you need to coordinate. Otherwise, you're going to be affected by the decisions others take and in which you may not be part. And in this fora or in this mechanism, there are the countries which have a larger impact in the global economy. There are almost 90% or more than 90% of the global GDP, and also in terms of population, they have the larger population among almost most of the countries. So, I mean, the decisions these countries take as a group, or as individuals, they can affect the global economy, and they can affect bigger or smaller. So you are there because you believe you want to solve issues in certain way. You could do the same in the multilateral organizations, but the process is much more slower. You always have
because they're universal and they are almost always created with a charter or with a convention, and it has certain rules which make the process a little bit harder to proceed. In the case of the G20, it's a very informal forum, an informal mechanism. We don't have rules, we don't have decision-making process. It's basically all by consensus and because you believe that you have to be there to solve these issues. So I do believe the idea is that it can be more efficient and faster to make decisions. And that's, well, what Mexico would like to preserve within the G20.
It goes perfectly well with the next question that was posted, because one of the questions was, how do decisions taken at the G20 actually affect a country internally, its economy?
Well, it's very important. For example, in 2008, when the crisis started, all the global economy went into recession, and it was the worst almost since the 1930s depression. So countries had to react to what was happening. People were losing their jobs, and you were not exporting. The banks were going bankruptcy. So some of the decisions that were taken there, if they have not been taken, the crisis would have been much more longer. In the case of Mexico, we didn't have a financial crisis because many years ago we had a very serious financial crisis, and we decided to take or change the rules, the way the banks work in Mexico, and in that sense we were prepared. But not all the countries were prepared, so there was a decrease in growth in all the countries, and so you had to take measures which you have to coordinate with others, because if you take them individually, you could affect even more some countries. I mean, in case of we decided that we shouldn't take protectionist measures because that will affect everybody, and that help to maintain jobs and to maintain our exports to other parts of the world. And also we decided that some things in banking shouldn't be done because they created problems for the global economy. So the decisions that G20 makes, they make a difference in your everyday life, in which you can maintain your job or you won't maintain your job, in which the way, if you have a credit, you're sure you will be able to pay it because your bank is, it's well funded, the bank. So there are different areas in which it affects your everyday life.
Switching a little bit of topics, we have a question from Italy, and it reads, do you think that investing in green development or green growth is still perceived by developing countries in the course of industrialization as a threat? Or do governments start to view it as an opportunity for economic growth?
Well, I think it's still a process for countries to understand that there's not a dilemma between growth and sustainability. Some countries have understand that you have to invest some resources on this kind of activities which protect the environment and your natural resources in order to save in the longer term money. But it's really an education process. It's also a taking conscience of this issue.
Perfect. And then the last question we have, it reads, it's actually from Mexico again, and it says, what is the function of the G20 on the promotion and development of new enterprises and business?
It's important to see the overall picture of the G20. The G20 has its formal governmental part, but it also has what it's called the B20, Business 20, in which business sector, they have deliberations and they make specific proposals for economic growth and the creation of jobs. And then there's also a young entrepreneurs forum in which young businessmen, they also make specific proposals. And you cannot disconnect what the government is doing from what other sectors of society are doing, and in specific this case, business sector. But you also have to take into account the trade unions, or you have to take into account the academics, many sectors of society who have opinions and who can have an impact on the decision making. In this case, I'm really very happy with the approach young people are taking of getting involved in what the G20 does. I think they are going to be the next Sherpas of the future, so it's important that since right now they start getting involved in the G20.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for answering the questions that were posted for you and in the IDEA forums. And thank you for watching us. And we invite you to keep following us in the U20 section of the G20 webpage, www.g20.org, as well as follow us on Twitter at G20 Mexico, #Y20Mexico. Thank you.